Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalia Misterishvili, and I would like to welcome you to PJM Winter webinar hosted by Genscape. For those who are not familiar with us, we're a market intelligence group that specializes in wholesale power across different RTOs in the United States. We cover regions like New York, New England, PJM, MISO, ERCOT, CALISO, and WEC. We provide trading opportunities on a daily basis through our reports, including topics like demand, generation, congestion risk, fuel pricing. If you do have any questions for us, we do encourage them. Please type it in provided section, and we will gladly answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, if you are interested in a free trial, we will provide information at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Brian McIntosh, the Regional Director for PJM.
Great. Thanks, Natalia. So just to introduce the team real quick, you just heard from Natalia, her and myself. We're the two regional directors on the PJM Market Intelligence team. And we also have with us on the call Roger Williams, who's one of our senior analysts who focuses more on our Bal-Week and next week reports and looking a little bit more at our term markets. So before we get too far into this, I know a lot of the people on the call have probably been watching Hurricane Sandy quite a bit over the last 2 days, and I did want to give you a little bit of an update on what we've been seeing, and then we'll get a little bit more into the winter outlook for everybody. So just on the most recent update we've looked at in terms of PJM, we're seeing a good 2 million plus customers in the PJM market still without power. We have seen over the last 2 days a significant increase in customers with getting their power restored. A lot of this has been seen across your southern half of the Mid-Atlantic and down into Dominion. We've seen a really volatile couple days here, especially during the morning ramping periods. I think you can really attribute this to those southern load zones that have been not really affected by Sandy as much as the New Jersey and Philadelphia region. I think as we get deeper into the day today and further into tomorrow, you'll see a significant amount of power restored, and we'll be getting back into normal operating conditions. If not tomorrow, by tomorrow afternoon, by Friday, and then into the weekend here. A couple last things that we did notice with Sandy is I think one of the big transmission pieces was it looked like the AP South interface was knocked down to zero, and there was no power flowing from West Virginia down into northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. Luckily, we did have a relatively mild last couple of days in terms of weather there, and we didn't see too much congestion, but we definitely saw it in energy costs being quite volatile. In terms of the generation supply stack, we did the biggest two nukes that we noticed coming offline were your Limerick and Salem number 1. Both of those units were either derated or ramped offline entirely. Salem Unit 1 is still off at this point, and it looks like the Limerick nuke has started to ramp as of yesterday. So that's definitely encouraging news, and it looks like we're getting closer and closer to normal operations. If you have any questions about the hurricane, feel free to put them in the question box as well, and if we have some time at the end of the call, we'll be more than happy to touch base on those. So now to get into the winter outlook, our agenda, and I'll go into some of the key conclusions that we have, and then I'll kind of walk you through it along with Rod, how we got to these conclusions. The first step we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about last year and last winter and get a feel for how that winter really shaped up. The next piece we'll talk about our seasonal demand and the weather forecast that our internal meteorologists have come up with. One of the key takeaways there that we've noticed is you'll see from last year we were really had a mild winter, as a lot of you know, and that was reflected both in the demand forecast, the real-time and day-ahead LMPs, and also your fuel pricing. This winter is going to be a little bit more different, a little bit different in that we're expecting a little bit more seasonal conditions with some more precipitation. While on the generation outage end of things, we're pretty similar. We don't see a ton of generation outages through the January-February period, but Rod will get into a little bit more there, and you'll see there are some differences between the 2 years. From the transmission standpoint, we still have some major transmission work going on, primarily the Mount Storm Dobbs outage and a Roseland to Whippany line outage that we'll talk to. And then finally, we'll get into the fuel pricing, and we'll see how the increase in fuel costs, or the rise in fuel prices over compared to last year is really impacting our supply stack and impacting the energy costs across the board. So when we get into last year, what you're looking at here is a slide that shows the monthly averages from December, January, February, in addition to the strongest days we saw by month. Now I know the traditional winter package is usually just January, February, but since we have a little bit more time, and I'm sure some of you are still looking at the December prices, we felt like it was beneficial for everybody to give you a little bit of insight there. So when we look at December, we see that we did have that really mild December. Generation started coming back from their fall outages, where our average load was less than 100 gigs, with a peak of 104.5. We didn't have a day that cleared above $50 for the month of December, so that's really rare for PJM. As we got into January, February, the biggest difference was as of January 1, we added DEOK to PJM, which brought in a number of baseload generation in the Cincinnati area, and brought in about up to 5 gigs of load. Again, we saw a really mild winter. We saw an average load of about 108 gigs in January, was higher than February. And our highest load day was January 13th of still under 115 gigs, which is really abnormal for PJM. Highest day of the winter was $57, and so the second piece on the right there, on the far right, is your gas pricing, and you can see the effect of the mild winter and what it had on the Henry Hub gas price, and that was also reflected in the PJM gas prices, which are typically, we usually look at mostly the TECO M3 or the Transco Z6 non-New York prices. And those prices followed suit, and that you see the highest prices were in January, and there was just a steady decline month over month. In terms of weather and demand, this kind of just further illustrates the picture here. You saw above normal temperatures across the board for all months. December was clearly the strongest there, especially in kind of the central part of the country, and especially in the Northeast, you still saw above averages. And this trend continued throughout the winter. So what you'll see is as we look a little bit more at this coming winter, it's hard to see this trend continuing. We don't necessarily anticipate an extremely cold and volatile winter, but we would anticipate a little bit more activity than what we saw in the last season. So what I'll do is I'm going to pass it over to Rod, and he's going to talk to you guys a little bit about our upcoming demand forecasts, and he's also going to get into a little bit more of the generation outages for everybody.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to start with a seasonal demand and weather outlook. This is generated from Genscape's meteorology team. And really for the December through February period, this graphic you're seeing is Genscape's temperature outlook, and the graphic is versus seasonal norms. So our Mets are really anticipating pretty significantly above normal temperatures for the western half of the continental U.S. and mildly seasonal above for the east, and in particular PJM. Really looking at a warmer northern half of the U.S., some variability in terms of month to month, with cooler trends most likely weighted towards February. In terms of PJM, the risk is overall seasonal, certainly compared to the very warm winter that we had last year. We are looking for cooler risks this year and associated upside risks on PJM demand with those colder temperatures. And really the risk is weighted at this stage more so towards the end of the winter period, moving into February, early spring at this stage. This next slide shows Genscape's outlook for precipitation versus seasonal norms. So again, we are looking for below average in terms of the West Coast. The eastern half of the U.S., we're really looking at more wetter and potentially snowier with the cooler outlook. Risks for the Mid-Atlantic South and pretty much most of the West here. Across the Midwest, across the MISO area, we'd really be looking for, again, it's around the seasonal norm area here. In terms of risks for PJM, greater impacts of snow, that precip combined with that cooler temperature outlook. And then, but really we're looking for seasonal or above seasonal temperatures to potentially offset some of that in the eastern half of the U.S. And let's look at just a comparison of Genscape's outlook versus the National Weather Service, the NWS. So they're actually looking at, in terms of temperature, pretty much around norm, so we're above them in terms of a temperature outlook, which would facilitate the downside on winter demand. In terms of precipitation, again, they're looking for seasonal norms in PJM, above for the southeast, with a cooler outlook, which would translate into more rain risk. In terms of PJM, again, looking for less precip, less snow risk to round out the January through the December through February period. So next, I'm going to look at generation outages. So this generation outages I'm showing is based on PJM's forecast capacity on outage number. So this is published 90 days out on PJM's website, and it's the sum of EDART, their maintenance outage tickets. The way that PJM is dividing this up is into West and Other. And so essentially the breakdown is for West is areas like AEP, Duke, Ohio, Com Edison, ATSI, and Allegheny Power. Other, you're looking at really the load centers on the East Coast, the Mid-Atlantic and South in particular. The graphic that you're seeing here is a year-over-year comparison of outages for November, December, and January. So overall, on a month-by-month basis and really on a weekly basis as well, we're seeing very little change in the overall totals here. The interesting thing that really jumps out of us when you break it down on a regional basis is significantly more outages in those other regions. So in this instance, we're really looking at the Mid-Atlantic and South versus the Western regions year over year, especially for moving into December. So with this in mind, there's obviously more outages in the East with potential for winter demand levels, which may set up a more risk on west to east power flows, interface risk, especially with some of the high voltage outages that Brian's going to talk about shortly. And then we also looked at any notable generation outages, particularly nuclear outages. So as you can imagine, over a winter period, there's really minimal nuclear outages. The two we wanted to call out was firstly the Calvert Cliffs 2 nuclear unit in Baltimore. So just under a gig of nuclear generation sitting in one of the largest load zones in the Mid-Atlantic, due to start a refueling outage in mid-February. With that in mind, calling for colder risks within the February time period, you may see greater risk for undercommitment, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic. The second notable outage we saw was the Dresden 3 nuclear unit in Illinois that serves primarily ComEd loads in the winter. Really looking at historically strong wind generation during that period, colder risks for the interior, for the Midwest. That Dresden outage towards the end of November, early December, you may see some of the downside pressure traditionally on ComEd and NI due to bearish NI hub constraints. You may see that eroded somewhat through the start of the winter period. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Brian, who's going to talk about some of the transmission outages we're looking at.
Great. So we're going to go through a few transmission outages that seem to have a pretty significant effect on PJM in the coming months. Several of them are already offline, but I think as we get into the colder months, they could have a much greater impact on PJM as a whole. But before we get into that, I just want to run through kind of our understanding of how power really flows through PJM. In the traditional sense, and that's changed a little bit now with some coal to gas switching, but the way power still tends to flow throughout PJM is your cheapest generation tends to be in the western half of PJM. ComEd usually has a surplus of generation made up of nuclear and coal, and they'll work their way out of ComEd into AEP. You get into the Ohio and then into even Pennsylvania and West Virginia, where you also have a lot of cheap baseload coal generation, and a lot of that's just going to flow a natural west to east pattern. And that's how you have your makeup of your 500X interface, which is the top arrow on the right. Followed just below that arrow is your Redington Black Oak interface, and then the two arrows on the bottom right are your AP South interface. And so you just have that natural flow of power, and that's kind of one of the key components of the transmission issues that we can potentially run into over the course of the winter. The second and the last final piece of it is the main reason for this is, like I said, you do have that cheaper power in the west. You also have your major load zones are primarily built up in the east, where you have your New Jersey down to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and then your cities in Virginia. They make up a significant chunk of the PJM demand, and that's why you tend to have that strong pull from west to east across the RTL. So the first outage we're going to talk about is Mount Storm to Dobbs. A lot of you may be familiar with this. It's a major transmission project that's ongoing in PJM. It's scheduled to be, the construction or new construction on the line is scheduled to be completed in 2015. The outages that they're doing on the line are broken up over the course of the next few years. What they're doing is they're taking the line out during basically all the months other than your summer months, your June, July, August. So we saw that out last year, and last winter it was out. But our expectation is as Rod touched on, with a little bit more seasonal demand, you'll have the potential for a little bit greater effect with this outage. So in this picture, you see the Mount Storm is on your left there. That's really the kind of source point of the AP South interface, and the Dobbs is on your top right, and that's the region of the PJM that you're really looking at. Is Mount Storm is eastern West Virginia, and Dobbs is where you're getting into northern Virginia, and then Loudoun is northern Virginia as well, and Valley is where you're more in the central Virginia region. When you take this line out, the first most obvious impact is a derate on the interface itself, and that just all that's telling you is you're going to be able to bring less power in from that cheaper western region, and you're going to rely on more expensive generation over by Loudoun, down by Valley, and potentially even north of that line. You can see just on the top is the Redington Black Oak interface. What we've seen so far is there have been some circumstances where you've seen AP South interface congestion. You tend to see this mostly when Dominion or PJM South is fairly undercommitted. And what happens is you get some really strong flows on the Mount Storm to Valley line. Another key indicator there is just south of Valley is the Bath County pump storage unit. When that Bath County unit is pumping, which it typically does overnight, you can get some pretty strong pulls on that Mount Storm Valley line. So I would predict that if you have a really cold winter day down in Virginia, that you're going to get a really strong pull on that Mount Storm Valley line over there on the left, and potentially drive some AP South interface congestion. You'll mostly see it during the ramping periods in the morning, but again, if you have a really cold day or two there in Virginia, or if you have any unplanned outages on some of the big nukes down there, whether it be North Anna, Surrey, there's some decent-sized gas units with Doswell and Fluvanna down there. Any of those units that are offline could influence stronger pulls there. The second piece that is impacted by this outage is over by Loudon, which is on the right-hand side of this picture. What you see is when the trail line was put into place back a couple years ago, you got a new 500 kV line flowing from Meadowbrook to Loudon. It's that yellow line on the right side. And what that's done is it's allowed more power to step down at Loudon and flow into northern Virginia and in toward Washington, D.C. And it's really taken some pressure off of Dobbs, which used to be a pretty significant congestion risk for PJM. What we expect is if you do have, again, a cold winter day or a cold winter week, you're going to see a lot stronger pull on that AP South line and into Loudon. And when you get either Loudon congestion or the Mount Storm Valley / AP South congestion, both of those are going to have upside impact on your West Hub pricing, your Dominion prices, and your PEPCO prices. So I'd say you definitely want to keep an eye out for any sort of undercommitment in PJM South, undercommitment or major outages in PEPCO. Even outages in BGE might influence some strong flows in and along that line. The second outage we want to talk about is the Roseland to Whippany 230 kV line. This line went out back at the beginning of the month, and for the first couple weeks of the month, we saw some decent congestion on the Redington to Roseland 230 kV line. It gave an upside signal to a lot of the PSEG generators, and what it seemed like is that we continue to see this congestion in the day-ahead market, but it hasn't been as persistent in the real time. And I think a big reason for it has been, number one, you've had a few generators, gas generators, that have ramped online over the course of the last couple weeks in kind of central New Jersey, and those have helped to limit the pull on the Redington Roseland line. So to kind of backtrack a little bit and show what you're looking at here, there's really three paths that you can flow power into the kind of central PSEG New Jersey region. The first is from the south, where you get power stepping down at Branchburg that comes in on the 500 kVs and flows in on those three lines there on the bottom, kind of on the bottom of your screen. The line that's red on your left is your Redington Roseland, which is one of your primary risks with this outage. The other area that's still available to flow power in is from the north. And what happens here is power flows from Branchburg up to Ramapo, which is a tie line with the New York ISO, and then back down into PJM on the Ramapo to South Mahwah to Waldwick tie line. That path is still in service, and that's another area that potentially could be at risk. The reason we don't highlight that as a greater risk than Redington Roseland is because I would tend to think that when you're going to have this type of congestion risk, you're going to have cold weather in New York just as much as you are going to have it in New Jersey. And for that reason, there's going to be less power available to flow south back into Jersey. New York's going to really want to keep almost all of that power that we export to them. The third and final way to move power into Jersey is really along that Roseland to Whippany path. It's where you see that X. It's those black 230 kV lines that are moving power in from eastern Pennsylvania and into Jersey. So you've taken out really that one path, and you potentially on a cold winter day, you don't really have a really strong excess capacity or excess generation to pull back down into PJM. So your risk really ends up being south, and that's where your Redington Roseland line becomes your primary risk there. So I think the reason you haven't seen it here is demand hasn't been as strong in the last couple months, in the last couple weeks. We've also had obviously the hurricane with very minimal to no demand in that region. But I think as we get further into the next month or two, I think you're going to see a lot more stress put on that Redington Roseland line, or potentially some of those other lines that you're seeing that flow power from south of Jersey up into PSEG. So now moving much further to the west, the next piece of congestion that we think is worth noting is your AD hub and NI hub congestion points. Rod touched on demand with some of the demand in seeing that, you know, when you get into these winter months, you tend to just naturally have a higher volume of wind generation coming along, and that can cause some issues for PJM. We've seen already this fall some record wind levels coming from MISO, and that's really caused some issues for the NI hub. And really, you've really seen it primarily during the off-peak, where you're getting some significant downside, on the NI hub. The other piece that you've really seen is the Dumont to Wilton center line has been out over the past few weeks here, and I think that's played a role as well. The Dumont-Wilton Center is your 765 kV line that moves that power from ComEd through NIPSCO and then into AEP. With that line out, which it's actually scheduled to be back in the next couple of days, they've put a lot more stress on those low voltage lines. So those blue and yellow lines that you're seeing on the map have had a lot more stress put on them. And when you see congestion there, you tend to see upside to the AD hub, downside to your NI hub, and then varying impacts on your NIPSCO. But so some of the notable wind constraints that I think have potential to see over this coming winter are really the usual guys that we've seen over the last year or two. But I don't see any reason why we'd see less or have them kind of completely eliminated off the map. The first being your Oak Grove Galesburg, which is a constraint that's primarily driven by your western Iowa wind generation, or your Iowa wind generation flowing along the 345s into ComEd and causing some upside impact on your NI hub. The other two constraints are your Monticello to East Winnemac and your Cumberland to Bush constraints. Those are a little bit further to the south and east, and you usually see those constraints based on central zone MISO wind or PJM wind itself. If you're a Genscape Power RT customer, our proxy unit that we use is usually the Fowler Ridge unit. That's one that we tend to really key in on and look at those wind levels to determine how much risk you're going to have on a Monticello to East Winnemac or Cumberland to Bush. I think both of them have a significant risk as we get into the January-February timeframe. So the final piece we're going to touch on is fuel pricing. And looking at the current gas market, and what we looked at first was we looked at the Henry Hub price, just because that's kind of I know that's really the proxy for a lot of the term trading, and not necessarily what people are, the physical players are using in the Bal-Day and next day market. But I think this gives us a good idea of what's been happening and how we can really compare it to last year. The first and most obvious piece is that when you look at the monthly gas pricing, you can see that we're up significantly from the last year's actual prices. And just to clarify, the current gas price that you're looking at is your monthly gas price and where it's been trading over the last week or so. and the middle column is going to be where the next day markets were settling on average for those months. So you can see a significant premium on the 3 months that make up the winter, and I think there's a few reasons for that. The first is you have, as Rod touched on, the more seasonal weather outlook. You also have the idea that there's a significant amount of gas-fired generation that's running, and we anticipate that to continue to be the case. When we looked at our supply stack with these numbers versus the previous year, while you do see a shift back to coal-fired generation a little bit further to the left on the supply stack, meaning it's the cheaper of the two fuels, you still see a significant amount of gas generation right there in the mix with some of your more expensive coal generation. And when you look at that from a demand perspective, a lot of these gas units, especially the ones in the east, still remain very competitive, and we don't anticipate them having a drastic drop-off at these gas levels. Now, there's a couple impacts that you'll have with these gas prices. The first is most obvious in that you should see stronger energy costs, and I think that's reflected in the monthly market, that we're seeing with a significantly higher West Hub price for both December, January, and February. The second risk that I wanted to touch on, and it's something to keep a note of and maybe keep track of, but it may be a little bit less likely to occur, but I think it is a significant upside risk to these prices if it were to occur, is over in the Marcellus Shale, which has been one of the key reasons why these gas prices are as low as they have been over the last couple of years, just that drastic increase in Marcellus production. We have been looking a little bit at the potential for freeze-off, and if we do get into a situation where you do have over 20 hours of freezing conditions, that might halt some production in the Marcellus Shale. And if that were to be the case, then that would give you a potential of a decent upside to these gas prices. Now, the odds that that's going to happen are relatively small. I mean, I think with our demand outlook, that kind of further reiterates that point that we don't anticipate a major upside or a major cold weather snap occurring for a significant period. But I think it is worth noting that if you were to see something come through where we did have some significant cold weather across that Marcellus Shale region, that it would be worth keeping an eye on the production out there and what it might do to the gas prices. So now to just kind of wrap up everything we've talked about, the first thing we touched on was our demand forecast, and what we saw there is we do anticipate a cooler winter compared to 2011, 2012. It's still seasonal, and I would say that we would see potentially a little bit more precipitation, which could obviously mean some snowier conditions and cause a few more transmission outages, possibly some generation outages that could pop up over the course of the coming months. From a generation outage standpoint, Rod kind of showed you that we are on a steady decline, working our way out of the fall outage season, and I think the one major takeaway that you can get from the forecasted outages is that you do have slightly more generation expected to be offline in the east over the course of your December, January months, and slightly more generation online in the western half of PJM, which could bring you to more of that transmission issues where we do have that Mount Storm Dobbs outage, and if we do have a shortage of generation in the east on certain days, and a surplus of generation in the west, you're going to have more stress on those interfaces, and not having one of those major lines like Mount Storm Dobbs could present an issue and give us some upside pricing to the West Hub. Lastly, we talked a little bit about the nat gas and how it's trading above last year. I think the key takeaway there is that even with the premium that's put on there compared to the last year's settles, I don't think that necessarily forces too much natural gas in the east to be taken offline. I think you're going to see a much similar setup to what we've seen this fall, with a lot of the gas in the east still available to run and being very competitive with your coal-fired gem. Now, the market seems to have priced a lot of this in already. Looking just recently at where we settled last year to where the markets are trading for the West Hub, your December market's trading about $10 above last year's settle, and then your winter package is trading close to $11 above last year's settle. So it seems like the market's already factored a lot of this in. When we looked at the supply stack, it seems like that even with these gas premiums, it's possible that those numbers are definitely a little high. And when we looked at, even when we brought those $1 of upside in the gas compared to last year, and even though we cleared in the $36, $37 range for those months, I'm not sure that just having that higher gas price and slightly higher demand really gets us into the high 40s, high 50s price range for the entire winter package. That kind of concludes what we'd like to touch on. I think we have a few questions that have come through, but please feel free to keep those coming. If you do have any interest in learning a little bit more about our Genscape product, you can get. We do offer trials, free trials for 2 weeks, where you can learn a little bit more about our Bal-Day next day and our Bal-Week next week products, and we can definitely talk to you there. You can either contact Bob Limp or go to our website. I know one question that we've had is whether the slides will be available. We'll definitely make the slides available for everybody, whether it'll be emailed via distribution list or on our website. I'm not 100% sure on, but we will 100% make sure that everybody that's on this call has access to the slides. So I think Natalia has a couple questions that have come through, and we can address those.
Right, so one of the questions that we have is that why we're seeing the less generation outages this year versus last year. And we had a quick discussion about it, and what we've noticed this year that most of the generation went on outage earlier in the season, starting September and October, and that's we think is due to low demand levels that we've been seeing, as well as low gas prices that have been observed this year. Second question that we have is, do we think the recent retirement of Potomac River will impact PEPCO prices, especially with Monster Dobbs outage?
Yeah, that's a good question, and what we have seen is one of the differences between last winter and this is we do have a few retirements, especially in your PEPCO. You have Buzzard Point, Benning, and Potomac all retiring. One thing to note about those units is they were highly inefficient and very rarely ran. I think they did run in some extreme circumstances, and I think with having Mountstrom Dobbs out does put some more pressure on your PEPCO, your BGE, and your Northern DOM. I'm not sure that you'll necessarily see a significant upside in PEPCO due to those units retired. I think having the Meadowbrook to Loudoun line really helps to increase the reliability down in Northern Virginia. And I think you also have a lot of generation, especially gas-fired generation, that, as we touched on, has been more competitive in the last year or so in Northern Virginia, whether it be your Doswell, Fluvanna, Remington has run a decent amount more. So you have a good amount of generation in Northern Virginia that can flow in there. With that said, if PJM does have issues in that Potomac or your Benning or Buzzard to Ritchie regions, those are extremely sensitive spots for PJM, and that question is definitely one that we get often, because I think a lot of us know that when you start to get congestion in downtown DC, things can really take off. But what we've noticed is that type of congestion has not been as prevalent. I wouldn't be surprised if you see it 1 or 2 days over the course of the winter. But I think on kind of a more macro scale, I think we're more keyed into your Loudon transformer and your AP South interface as a more longer term risk.
Another question we have is what generation we observe to occur online this year. And what we have seen is there's nothing major scheduled to come online this coming year, or no major deactivations either. But we have seen quite a few units being decommissioned in 2013 in AP, PEP, and ATSI. We've seen those Buzzard, Benning, Armstrong, Potomac, the ones that Brian has mentioned, as well as Bayshore and Eastlake in ATSI that have been decommissioned in September. However, there is nothing major coming in or offline in 2013 as of right now.
So we're just taking a look at some of these questions as some have come through. So we had a question about the Transco Z6 non-New York and the the TECO M3 fuel cost, and whether it's a weighted average based on volume by area. The way we look at those fuel prices is our model has a fuel price associated with it based on its location and what pipelines it's tied to. So our prices are never necessarily, we don't use necessarily one natural gas price when we look at forecasting prices. We actually have different fuel prices tied to each generator. In terms of the natural gas prices that I was showing earlier, those were all Henry Hub prices. What you can take from those when you get access to the slides, you can probably put a standard adder onto those. I believe you can, M3 in non-New York typically have anywhere from a 10 to 50 cent adder on them, depending on the day and depending on the weather conditions. We did also have some questions in terms of pipeline constraints. We saw virtually no pipeline constraints last year. We do have a natural gas group that I was able to talk to a little while ago, and he indicated to us that while a couple of years ago we saw some really significant pipeline constraints that sent the PSEG in northeastern parts of PJM prices skyrocketing, we don't really anticipate that to be the case going forward. One key piece of that is the Marcellus shale production. The other component is just that the production that's been done in the New York, New England region that is kind of mitigated some of the risk, and he really in our contacts within our natural gas group felt that if you were going to see pipeline constraints, it would really be you'd see the upside effect on your New York, New England pricing, whereas your PJM group would really stick a lot closer to your Henry Hub and really only see that minimal upside that you see on a daily basis, as opposed to that really, really strong spread that we saw 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, looks like we're all set on questions. If anybody has any questions or anything like that, you can definitely I would say first touch base with Bob Limp if you want some more information on getting a PJM trial, or if you look at any of the other markets within within the U.S. We do ERCOT, MISO, New York, New England, Cal ISO, and the WEC markets. So if you have any interest in hearing more about those, please feel free to get in touch with us and request a free trial. Definitely want to thank everybody for taking the time and listening to this webinar, and hopefully look forward to hearing from some of you in the future. Thank you.